So the last age group that we're going to talk about is older adults and elders, um, bringing in that kind of liberation psych perspective here. When you think about the intersections of older populations and climate, what comes to mind first? So that might be you think about aging relatives who've struggled in recent weather events and heat waves, that you feel concerned for them. You might feel like older people are generally pretty helpless, that they need a lot of outside support. You might assume that older people are uninformed, that they don't care, that they don't believe in climate change. And we might not immediately think about the resources that this age group has, things like resiliency, life experience, wisdom, community organizing, and leadership skills. Like we can see in this quote here, older people have experience and expertise that we can leverage to impact climate change, the action that we're taking, and the emotional processing that we're doing. And when we think about our futures and the places and resources and experiences that we may lose as climate change progresses, thinking about future generations who may never have access to these things, do we consider that there are losses that our elders have already experienced? Um, do we consider how those experiences of loss can be used to motivate change? And do we think about what we can learn from how they've learned to live with these changes and with the related emotions that come up through experiencing that loss? The mental health side of things. So we know there's very few studies on older adults, elders, and climate change, but what we have seen is that older adults are 2 times more likely to develop PTSD after exposure to natural disasters. And older adults who had escaped wildfires reported anxiety, depression, insomnia, nightmares, and PTSD. Conversely, age can also be a protective factor against PTSD through things like life experience with previous disasters and life challenges more generally, leadership connections in the community, more positive emotions and more of a sense of optimism, religious support, and through providing strength and guidance for younger generations. This study interviewed older adult environmental activists, so people who have been doing this action before we had all the terms for it that we have today, um, and the feelings of grief, pain, anger, and sadness that they experience, but also moments of joy and hope. Some of those interviewed talked about a sense of it being too late. Quote here, "It's not going to impact my life that much, so I'm kind of resigned to it." Um, the importance of place for older adults, so where younger people, you may be used to thinking of things on more of a global scale. Older adults may be more connected to the place where they grew up or currently live and doing, conservation, preservation work in that area. Um, and they also talked about experiences of loss as fuel for activism. So that's that turning those difficult emotions into sparks for action. They spoke to the impact of having a supportive group environment, of feeling, a sense of confidence through creating action, connecting to their community, and seeing that, we're not going to see the outcome of these actions in our lifetime, but they will go on through future generations, whether they have children or grandchildren or not. And this article by Marchand, I really recommend. She's speaking to Indigenous elders who, depending on life experience, may have particular knowledge specific to place. And at the same time, they have in many cases already experienced profound loss of connection to place, the local knowledge, and ecological destruction. Um, so there's the bridging of knowledge of those ecological cycles and the changes to their ways of life. Um, they are really guardians of this ecological knowledge specific to place, um, and they model resilience in the face of climate colonialism. Going back to our wheel of emotions, the Seriton article, the first one that I discussed, talks about how older adults, they might not feel as much climate anxiety as other emotions because generally they don't feel they're going to be alive for the worst of it. But they might feel more guilt, more of a sense of ethical responsibility for the lives that they've lived. Um, they might feel a sense of concern for future generations. There's potential for hopelessness, seeing what hasn't changed within their lifetimes or has gotten worse, as well as grappling with a sense of complicity and responsibility. So this quote here is from that Seriton article. The ability to live with ambivalence and accept one's ethical responsibility while keeping things in perspective is an important psychological task when dealing with climate change. She's talking here about older adults specifically, but this could, of course, be applied to all of us facing a climate changing world. Lastly, on the older adult side of things, activism helps, taking action helps. There's a group called Third Act based in the States, which is an organization for adults over 60 who engage in environmental action, things like community building, voter registration campaigns, letter writing, switching banks and credit cards to divest from fossil fuels. And before we get into Trevor talking about long-term thinking, just a note that we've split this presentation into age groups for the purpose of keeping things organized, but it's really important to remember that we are connected across age and any other social categories and experiencing climate change and working to make a difference. Age groups differ in terms of experience, resources, how they'll be impacted, but we have more to learn from each other than we have differences and conflicts to identify. Dialogue is active work and emotional work. Intergenerational dialogue is no exception. Young people might feel that older adults don't care or aren't listening to them, while older adults might feel dismissed or feel that complicity for being part of the problem. This is, of course, a much bigger conversation to be had here about how to have dialogue across differing opinions. But before we get too far down that rabbit hole, I will hand it over to Trevor to talk about thinking across generations and into the future.
Thank you, Julia. So for this part, I use this as an exercise that can kind of work in a variety of age groups, but this idea of kind of long-term thinking. So the book I drew from here was Roman Sarnik's The Good Ancestor. He's sort of a public philosopher. And now there's some research that's started to come out as well in the psych field around these sort of exercises that really trying to get people to start thinking, not constantly, but to make space to kind of think about things beyond the short term. And here, short term can be minutes, hours, days, even weeks. When he's referring to long term here, what we're talking about is things that are centuries, decades, centuries long, things that go beyond your lifespan. And that part of the argument is that historically, we really evolved to make short-term decision making. It's what makes up the majority of our life, our day-to-day. The person who ran the fastest from the grass that rustled tended to live. And likewise, day to day in your many decisions, whether it's digital distractions or it's day to day, you're gonna walk to work, you're making small decisions. But we don't have a lot of time to really dedicate to thinking in longer term. And there are real benefits to that, though. So if we go to the next slide. When it comes to sort of thinking on the longer term, in the shorter term, things like digital distraction, we all get, distracted by our social media, the idea of political presentism, this focus on what next year is going to be, hot, or what in the next 4 years, or for the upcoming elections, not often taking these longer perspectives. Yet, if we often look at things in more the humility of deep time, the hundreds of thousands, millions of years and billions of years that have passed in the universe, if we take a look at legacy mindset, which is the idea of thinking about what do you want the world to look like after you're dead, after you've passed away. And I will say this stuff is not to Roman Sarnik's credit, not to him or to myself, but these ideas and thinking have been seen in indigenous communities of various types throughout North America. with the idea of intergenerational thinking. So again, sometimes this is heard of as seventh generation thinking, 150, 250 years out. What do I want the world to look like? From a career perspective, historically, there were some people who, would build these things like cathedrals that would take a century or two to make, which is kind of unheard of to have a building project that your child or your great or your grandchild would work on and finish, but really having this sort of intergenerational sort of focus. This is particularly important because if we go to the next slide, what we really need to do is avoid enslaving future generations to the present. We have to make sure that our choices for today are not really taking away from the futures generations that will follow us. So to kind of bring people into this, I'm going to go through an exercise that I use with clients around visualizing the future. We're going to do it a little bit abbreviated today for the purpose of today's presentation, but this can really create a rich conversation for workshops as well as individually. So I want to start by getting comfortable. You can close your eyes, get relaxed. I want you to envision a child that you have positive sentiments towards. It can be your own, it can be someone else's child, but envision that child. Then envision that child growing up, growing to middle age, and growing to old age. And then imagine that child when they're at old age holding their great grandchild. And as they hold that great grandchild, they look out their window. Imagine, what do they see? What do you hope that they see, I should say? When they look out that window holding their great grandchild, what do you hope they see? And then I would ask people to write that down. Now, if we move to the next slide, after you finish writing down everything that you see in that world, I want you to imagine you're writing a letter to that great grandchild as they will grow up about the legacy you yourself left them. And finish one of the following three sentences. The long-term projects I pursued that extended beyond my lifetime was. The legacy I hope for you and for the living world is. Or in the years following the 2020 COVID pandemic, and finish that sentence, that statement. Take your time. Sometimes the letters that can be written here, I would normally extend out, 10 minutes to give people to write, can be really rich. And notice that I would often ask, what do they hope for? So again, we're having that idea of what from this uncertainty do they hope the world will look like? And then giving people space to talk about that. Okay, next slide. And that's it. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you coming out with the presentation. For those listening, is pre-recorded. Again, this would be the final part of our series, but if you do have questions, you're welcome to check us out. We have our emails on there. We have our websites on there. And, we wish you all the best in building a better world.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.